All right, so can you see my screen okay? Yeah. All right, well, thank you. Thanks very much for coming, everyone, especially if it's the middle of the night where you are. It's quite a hospitable time here in the UK, early morning, but not too bad. And thank you again for being invited to give this talk. Certainly when we wrote this paper all those years ago, we couldn't have imagined it would resonate so well. So it's a wonderful chance to reflect on this paper and the influence that it's had. So just to get us going, I wanted to acknowledge Slayer because I did nick the title of this talk from the title of their live album, Decade of Aggression. I'll always use any chance I can to reference thrash metal in my work. But also, a decade of aggression sort of resonates a bit with a decade of vegaphobia, because after all, that's kind of what we were talking about, was hostility towards vegans in some ways. But that's where the title comes from, reflecting on evidencing anti-veganism, because that's what we were really doing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hand over to Karen in a moment, and she's going to talk through the kind of background to the paper and what we found out. We won't go through detail because it's, over 10 years old. So we don't just want to recapitulate our findings. And then I'll talk a bit more about what we feel has been the legacy of the paper and looking ahead to the future as well. So on that note, over to Karen.
Thanks, Matthew. So why we started looking at and thinking about vegaphobia in the first place was because we had, as many vegans do and have over the years, we had a sense that there was an unfavourable cultural perception of veganism. So we were personally experiencing anti-vegan stereotypes and assumptions being made about us, talking to our vegan friends and colleagues and fellow activists. We were coming across that we were finding they were experiencing the same sort of thing. And we were also really aware that vegans and veganism were missing from academia. We just weren't there at all. And we wanted to make use of our kind of our sociological expertise, our sociological credentials to start looking at how vegans were represented out there in the wider world. And we felt that veganism really should be a legitimate sociological topic, and it really wasn't particularly being looked at the time. So we started looking at these. What we saw was the misrepresentation of vegans and veganism, and we decided that we were going to do this by looking at the data that was already out there, the data that was most widely available, that we thought that materials that were including or alluding to representations of other animals would be a really valuable source of data. And we thought, looking at news media in particular, that was going to be a particularly useful or valuable source of data. News media is produced in specific contexts, specific social and cultural contexts, and as such it can provide really valuable insights into society. And for vegan and critical animal studies scholars, materials such as news media are really useful because they allow identification and critical analysis of the prevailing discourses relating to vegans, the prevailing discourses around which attitudes to non-human animals are constructed. And it really helps us to understand the discursive positioning of attitudes to both vegans and non-human animals. And we were looking at the intersecting discourses as well. So the intersecting discourses of intrahuman differences that speak to other inequalities. So inequalities around gender, race and class. And we wanted to carry out a kind of critical analysis of these materials in order to be able to think about constructing counter discourses. Until we understood what the discourses were that were out there, it was more difficult to come up with a sociologically acceptable counter discourses. Next slide, please, Matthew. So, as I said, we looked at news media. We used a database called LexisNexis that gave us access to all the news media over a period of time. And we, using certain keywords like vegans and veganism, we came up with a sample of 397 sources. And maybe we shouldn't have been surprised, but we were quite surprised at how many of those resources were negative. There were, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but something like 80%, I think, were negative references to veganism. So when we came up with the sources, we looked at what was positive, what was neutral, so just kind of commenting on veganism without actually really saying anything, and then what was negative. So kind of ridiculing vegans and veganism. And one of the key things that we found was that whenever vegans or veganism were referred to, we were separated from our reasons for becoming vegans. We know already that most vegans become vegan because of concern for other animals. So there's a real anti-speciesist, sorry, I can't say that this early in the morning, call to being vegan. But that was never mentioned in any of the articles we looked at. So there's this disarticulation that's going on. But there was a lot of reference to lifestyle veganism. Sorry, next slide. Thank you, Matthew. So we, having done the research, we decided to be quite ambitious in where we were aiming to get this published, because we really wanted to make vegans and veganism more thoroughly embedded in sociology, as I said. So we targeted the British Journal of Sociology, which was the top UK sociology journal at the time. I don't think we really expected it to get published there, but we thought we'd kind of go for the top. And it was a very slow and difficult process. We had unusually 5 reviewers looking at it. We had to go through 2 rounds of revisions. They kept coming back asking us to do things, but it was worth it in the end. We did actually manage to get it published in there in the end. And for Matthew and for myself, actually, it's now our most cited article. So it's been cited, as of yesterday when I checked, 347 times. I've just seen the comment come through. Thank you, Linda. That's great to know. So it really has had an impact, and we can see that it's having an impact. So we feel we sort of achieved what we wanted in getting it out there and getting people to think about these prevailing attitudes to vegans and veganism. Matthew, I'm going to pass back to you now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Karen. Yeah, and one thing I forgot right at the beginning, which I should have said, is thanks to Erica Cudworth, who actually came up with the word vegaphobia. If I remember correctly, in a pub after a couple of drinks, when I was just telling her about what we'd been finding out, and she said, "Oh, that sounds like vegaphobia." And I thought, "Oh, there's a good name for a paper." So many thanks to Erica. I'm not sure if she's here or not, but anyway. wanted to make sure we didn't forget that. So in terms of, oops, there we go. In terms of sort of legacy of the paper, obviously we're going to hear about much more recent research in this panel, but I just wanted to mention a couple of things. So, you know, very happily I've had the chance to incorporate this work into my teaching at the Open University. And as part of that process, I was able to research some of the other publications that had referenced our paper. So I just included a couple of examples on the slide here, bearing in mind where a lot of us are joining from Australia and from the USA, and also just to show how this seems to resonate outside the UK. So this is very, you know, still an Anglophone perspective, but nonetheless interesting that it resonates, not just where me and Karen are. So this first example from Masterman, Smith, Ragusa and Crampton in Australia. So they pretty much replicated our methodology quite precisely, I think. And they found a lot of similarities, and they boiled it down to these two key themes: that vegans were represented as being irrational, and that the practice of veganism was represented as impossible. So that's really similar to what we found in the UK. So it's a way of ridiculing and marginalizing veganism, vegans ourselves, but also saying that pursuing veganism is not worth the attempt. So what's embedded there is this assumption that the readership is non-vegan, that they're addressing non-vegan readers. So that was another kind of thing that I don't think we wrote about as such in the original paper. We might have mentioned it, but we didn't bring it out. But it was really obvious looking back, and seems to recur in other research. And then the second example from Barker, or Barsa, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And she found, I summed up with a couple of quotes there, that newspaper coverage in the US deflects the ethical dimensions of veganism. So that again touched on what we found in the original paper about veganism being disarticulated from the motivations for veganism, separated from anti-speciesist discourses, and instead portrays vegans as cultural others, so reproducing again these negative stereotypes. So that was, you know, again, a really interesting finding. I guess when we first started, we thought we'd find a lot of stories linking veganism with animal rights activism, and using animal rights activism as a form of extremism by association with which veganism would be marginalized. But we didn't find that. We didn't find that whatsoever in our original research. And that seemed to be a recurrent theme as well, which was surprising, but on reflection kind of makes sense, because it's a way of taking the critical power away from veganism. So anyway, I won't say more on that because we're going to hear, you know, some exciting new research imminently. But just to go back to the teaching again. So this is just a screen grab from an Open University textbook that I worked on last year or the year before. And it's from this module, Social Research, Crime, Justice and Society. So it's a co-production between sociology and criminology at the Open University. And as you can see, I got the chance to basically recapitulate what we did in the paper as a means of teaching documentary analysis as a research method. So it's a research methods module. And when we first wrote the paper, when we were working on it, it seemed like a very distant prospect that we'd be able to actually teach in this way, access the mainstream, if you like, and you know, address undergraduate students with these kind of findings in the context of something like research methods, you know, a generic module that's teaching the skills of research rather than being flagged up as, you know, vegan studies or an animal rights course or something like that. So that's been really exciting for me to be able to do that. And then just another example. So this is still a work in progress. This screen grab is from an Open Learn course on speciesism and veganism. So Open Learn is the Open University's free online platform. So it's open to the public. There's no paywall. Anyone can access it anywhere in the world with an internet connection, of course. And this course we're hoping will launch for World Vegan Day, 1st of November. It's very nearly ready, and this screen grab is, I guess, from a production draft. So it might be tweaked a little bit, but it's basically going to look something like this. And we got some exciting animated videos included in it, which are voiced by Benjamin Zephaniah. I'm sure some of you know Benjamin Zephaniah's name and work. He's well known for his veganism in the UK, among many other things, of course. And as you can see, we've got Vegaphobia squarely there as part of this public education. So, you know, this sort of blows my mind still that 10 years or a bit more later, I'm able to use this work to reflect back to a public audience, you know, an audience who we thought were being, well, lied to about veganism, basically, in the mainstream media, in the news media. And here's our chance to have a response to that. And then finally, we just want to end with some points for discussion or reflection. So I think we'll be having like a Q&A at the end of the panel, if I remember rightly, rather than right now. So these are not questions for immediately, but maybe something we might come back to. So, you know, we continue to be interested in how things have changed or stayed the same over time, and we're going to find out some more about that imminently, of course. And how does vegaphobia differ across different countries, different cultures, and different types of media? So we were interested in the print media at the time, and arguably the significance of print media is diminishing gradually, although perhaps its online presence has revived it or reconfigured it in some ways and maybe made it more risky for vegans perhaps and for non-human animals. So what has been the impact of social media? Again, of course, that's really taken off since our original research. Has it intensified these experiences, these processes, or has it provided a route for vegans to deconstruct it? So OpenLearn isn't social media, but it is an online platform by which I can try to deconstruct vegaphobia. So, you know, there's some positives here as well, I'm sure. And also we're just interested in what are all of our experiences of these kinds of discourses? Is it something we have been aware of all throughout our vegan lives? Has it got worse? Has it faded? I mean, my impression is of things kind of getting better because the space for positive representations of vegans has expanded, but that doesn't mean that the negative portrayals have gone away. So we just picked out a couple of exemplary instances of that on the slide here. So the one at the top, the picture of Heather Mills McCartney as she was then, this is in our original paper, these quotes, obviously deeply offensive ways of describing her in the Daily Star, which is a very low quality tabloid newspaper in the UK, for those of you who don't know. But then almost right up to date, just from last summer, we get this headline from The Express, which is another tabloid newspaper in the UK, very heavily right-leaning. Lunatics in every society, says Jeremy Clarkson, of vegan criticism toward farming. Jeremy Clarkson is a media celebrity for reasons that are unfathomable to me. He's a deeply unpleasant person, it seems, but anyway, he's got a lot of notoriety and a platform in the UK, and one of his latest enterprises is to begin farming, which includes exploiting non-human animals, and this is how he responds to criticism from vegans, referring to us as lunatics. So in some ways, nothing has changed, right? This is a clear continuation of this earlier intersection of ableism and vegaphobia. But I don't think it's all that bad. That's my impression anyway. So, you know, on reflection, I'm sorry to leave you with Jeremy Clarkson as the end of our paper. That's a real downer. But anyway, that's what we did. So I think we're out of time. So that's our reflection on a decade of vegaphobia, and thanks for listening. So if I can remember how to hand back hosting, Zoe.
I've just taken it from you rudely.
You've done it?
I have, yeah. Not
Brilliant.
that I didn't trust you. You're very capable, and thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to see if I could hand it back over to Corey now, who's going to show us the next presentation in video form. We might end up taking a break after this because I think I might have fixed the co-hosting and then it will be fixed on the way back, but you know. So I'm going to share with Corey now.
Aha. Can you see then the links?
Sorry, can you press record, Corey? For some reason it turns up every time.
Hold on. It moved my menu somewhere. It's trying to find where it took it. It says recording already. It says pause or stop. Okay. All right, but you can hear me and you can see the blank screen. All right, so yeah, Norm, unfortunately, due to personal issues, bless him, he wasn't able to make it today, to his great disappointment and to our great disappointment. But basically, Norm is a PhD student who has replicated the Vegaphobia study. And so we thought it would be really interesting, and also, of course, worked with Matthew, that it would be really, really interesting to see updated, like in more recently, how the findings would come out. And quite, sorry if I'm repeating myself, but quite ironically, I also, working on a book chapter for Zoe, decided I would try to replicate the study, thinking it'd be something quick that I could do. It's not quick, it took ages. But it's kind of interesting to see that me and Norm both looked at the same time period and tried to replicate the same study. We came up with pretty much the same results, but we did have significantly different takes at certain points, or we chose to highlight different things, put it that way. So anyway, I'm going to push play on Norm's talk, and I will also be uploading this to YouTube with his permission. So if there's any kind, if it's kind of hard of hearing or anything, I don't always quite trust pushing play in Zoom, but anyway, that's the plan. Let's see here.
Hello everyone, I'm Norman Riley. I'm a year 2 researcher in the Department of Sociology at the University of Essex, and I'm delighted and massively grateful to be given the opportunity to talk at this conference. There's so many names on the conference program notes with which I'm familiar, names that I've used over the last few years on, I mean, loads of occasions in writing since I returned to education, and it's a real honour to be here. It really is. And to be on a panel with Matthew Cullen and Corey Wrenn too, who I'm going to say this, but two absolute heroes of mine for the work that they've produced. It's outstanding, and it's inspired me. There's no two ways about it. So to be on a panel with those two it really is something else. And I just hope that what I presented here can be deemed worthy of being in such a esteemed company. Obviously, if not, then you know my contact details are on the last slide. Just send an email saying, mate, nah, sorry, that was terrible. But also apologies for this mic. The mic on the laptop's atrocious, so it does look like I'm about to burst into song any second. But fear not, I'm not going to deliver this presentation in any musical form whatsoever. And final apology is the accent. I appreciate that I talk quickly and I've got a strong regional accent. I do try my hardest to tone it down, but sometimes the broad jolly just comes straight through. So again, any issues with understanding, send us a message and just say, mate, didn't understand that. Can you repeat it? It was ridiculously hard to understand. Cheers. And I will do, I won't be offended. So let me just share the screen and crack on with the presentation. There we are. All right, got my slideshow. Apologies for the slowness in this, but I'm just terrible at it, basically. So the paper, PC-Ravaged clones or plant-powered pioneers. It's a paper that I've written from my MA dissertation. I'll go into that in a bit. And in terms of the actual title of it, it was inspired by Piers Morgan, that phenomenal TV personality and journalist. He quotes who on the vegan sausage roll by Greggs in 2019, 2020, I mean, really got excited, got really angry about it, and you know, put out that very outrageous tweet, nobody's waiting for a vegan bloody sausage of PC-Ravaged clones. As well, no idea how the mind boggles. It's just truly spectacular, to be perfectly honest with you. So I just want to say cheers, Piers, ultimately. But no, I mean, the as I say, the paper, it comes from my MA dissertation, which I finished in 2021. It got the David Lockwood Prize for Best Sociology dissertation at the postgrad level. And I then was encouraged by my supervisor to narrow it down, edit it, and put it out for publication. And it's been accepted by the Journal of Critical Animal Studies with gigantic revisions. I mean, really huge revisions. So I might get around to digging those in the next 5 years, by which point the paper is probably going to make totally irrelevant. But you know what? We'll crack on. So, you know, a bit of the background. The study, like, I'm not, you know, there's no denial. It was massively inspired by Karen Morgan, Matthew Cole's fantastic 2011 paper on Vegaphobia. That paper I picked up once again after reading Piers Morgan's comments, and I just thought, you know what, this is where I want to go in terms of my dissertation. I want to use this as a template and maybe do a kind of an exploration of veganism in UK media in 2020. As we know, you know, various studies in the past have, you know, they've seen that vegans have been thought of by the wider public is, you know, caring, considerate, and virtuous, but ultimately the majority of works seems to suggest that vegans are viewed as, you know, as other and in a variety of derogatory terms. Male vegans seen as not real men. We know obviously the links between meat eating and masculinity in the global north from lived experience. When I became a vegan, you know, working on building sites, delivering beer, I was working in manual work, and I was on the receiving end of what people might deem as banter, but ultimately was homophobic and misogynistic abuse due to the veganism, because, you know, I wasn't seen, I guess, as a real man, despite the fact I was doing these manual jobs with these people, because I refused to consume non-human animals. And, you know, as recently as 2019, research by Muller and Hennick found that in the UK, that discrimination and harassment of vegans in the workplace was endemic. And of course, you know, mass media, as we know, it has huge power. It can influence public opinion, and it does tend to promote the practices of the hegemonic culture. The UK is an omnivorous or meat culture, and therefore vegans as a minority do tend to be denigrated. The literature bears that out. Obviously, Karen and Matthew's incredible seminal study of UK newspapers published in 2007, you know, showed that vegans were portrayed in very negative light. Some of the choice words up there on the screen, and this research was backed up by research from Australia, Marston and Smith et al. In 2014. You also had Barker in 2020 studying US newspapers. Again, vegans seen overwhelmingly negatively, and 2015 in Laura Wright's work in the Vegan Studies Project. Laura's work found in 5 countries where we're looking at New Zealand, the UK, the USA, and France. So 4 countries, sorry, that stories were placed in newspapers where infants were being neglected, who basically starved to death. Of vegan parents, the vegan diet was being blamed, and the vegan parents were being blamed, whereas obviously the majority of children who die from nutritional neglect are from omnivorous parents. So the position of the veganism being the problem is obviously incredibly problematic, and how vegans are then portrayed and seen by the wider public. So what does this do? Well, obviously, you know, I used Melanie Joy's carnism is the kind of theoretical framework through which to do my analysis. And, you know, these framings, they reinforce the carnist belief system that, you know, killing non-human animals and consuming them is normal, nice and necessary, and vegans obviously are seen as outside that culture, outside that carnist culture, therefore they're deviant, and ultimately, you know, speciesism and the perpetuation of mass slaughter is reinforced. So the objectives of the study really were, I guess, to see whether or not there were any changes in terms of how vegans are portrayed in 2021 in the UK, 2020 in the UK, given that, you know, since Karen and Matthew's study, the number of vegans has risen quite substantially. And, you know, I also thought maybe, well, with the link between, you know, zoonotic disease such as COVID and industrial animal agriculture, the consumption of non-human animals, bird flu as well, you throw in there, obviously CGD many years ago, so-called mad cow disease, with kind of wider public knowledge of the links between animal agriculture and climate degradation, and with, you know, the prevalence in the media, on social media of celebrity vegans, right? I thought, well, maybe this kind of wider acceptance of veganism, of, you know, plant-based eating, then maybe we'll see a significant decrease in negative portrayals and perhaps a very strong increase in positive portrayals. And ultimately, the final objective, I suppose, is to see whether or not this information that I produced could, you know, what it might mean for advocates and activists, if it could be helpful in any way to what they're trying to achieve. So unlike Karen and Matthew, I couldn't do a Foucauldian discourse analysis because, to be honest with you, at the time, I had no idea what it was. Subsequently, I've done a course on it, and there's no way I could have done a Foucauldian discourse analysis in the time I had, given that it was a master's dissertation. There was a very limited time frame. I chose 6 national mainstream UK newspapers based on kind of political views, so 3 relatively you know, centre, maybe 1 left, the Mirror, you could argue, and 3 sort of right-wing newspapers from centre right to, I mean, not extreme right in case the Daily Mirror, you could argue. Whereas obviously Karen and Matthew did the full gamut of UK national newspapers. The reason, again, it was time constraints. And if you look at my period, I selected January to April 2020, I got 1,044 articles, whereas Karen and Matthew got 397 across the same newspapers for the whole of 2007. Methodology I followed, you know, I replicated Karen and Matthew's methods in terms of the keyword search, and in terms of codes I borrowed from them. Inductive codes obviously arose as I analysed the data, and I also allocated articles as positive, negative, and neutral based on how I perceived them. So there'd obviously be differences because of different subjectivities, but I'd imagine there'd be similarities there. In terms of results, I found that, you know, roughly 80% of articles could be deemed as positive, which would suggest a rise. Again, you know, it can't be a direct comparison given the difference in research methods and number of newspapers studied, etc. But, you know, I found 18%, whereas Karen and Matthew found 5.5%. Neutral articles I found almost 40% compared to 20%, and negative articles I found almost 43% compared to almost 75% in Karen and Matthew's study. The overwhelming amount of positive portrayals focused on health and body aesthetics, so people basically being encouraged to go vegan or plant-based for reasons of health, personal health. The environmental angle was prevalent, so, you know, eat less meat, you know, reduce meat, become vegan in order to, you know, save the environment, save the planet. And there were mentions, obviously, of tasty food as well, recipes, comment on how good vegan food was. Greg's vegan sausage roll, hello Piers Morgan, got quite a lot of positive traction. What I did find, and I'm not going to go into this in any greater detail, it's something I might explore later on down the line, is that you would have a lot of recipes that were, you know, for omnivores, right? So containing meat and dairy, and then next to it you have make this vegan, which you could perceive as a positive, but at the same time you could also perceive it as, well, you're still posting the vegan meal as secondary to the normal omnivorous meal. That's research I may look into further down the line. I might get some disagreement off my fellow panelists on that particular position as well. So ultimately, you know, I mean, you could argue, I guess there were more positive articles, but ultimately there's still 2.5 times more negative than positive. And of those negative articles, over halfway in what we call right-wing newspapers, so that'll be the Times, the Sun, and the Daily Mail, in my study. And this finding aligns with studies by Hodgson and McInnes and Don et al., suggesting that people higher in right-wing tendencies tend to have more negative perceptions of vegans and show less empathy for non-human animals. So in terms of the key findings, I'll just touch on 3. There were quite a few because it wasn't any of dissertation, as I say, but the ones I focused on here are what I call veganism as dishonest. So rather than vegan food being positive as healthy, you know, we know the kind of, you know, the scientific work suggesting that people on vegan and vegetarian diets do tend to have better health overall than people on omnivorous diets or meat-heavy diets. But these negative articles would focus on vegan junk food and say, this is how bad vegan food is for you. You know, this vegan burger contains X amount of salt compared to a meat burger, which contains a lot less. You wouldn't really get these like-for-like comparisons. It would literally be unhealthy vegan food against healthier, not necessarily healthy, but healthier non-vegan food. So it kind of creates this image of, oh, vegan food, it's not that healthy, is it? It's very processed. Maybe meat is better for me. And also you had the veganism being posted as not good for the environment through the amount of water that it takes to produce the almonds for almond milk, the fact that, avocado, where avocados are grown, it entails the moving of beehives, which leads to the death of bees. Also, the fact that, stories about in Mexico that avocado farmers are essentially being forced into kind of enforced labor and gangs are involved. So there's a lot of criminality, suggesting that vegans who, live on just obviously almonds and avocado are kind of, harming humans and harming the planet. And obviously, yeah, the soy argument as well, the deforestation linked to the growth of soy without any kind of mention of the fact that, 75% plus of all soy grown is used to create animal feed to feed the animals that are then killed for human consumption. So you have this kind of image of these holier than thou vegans who are actually, all destroying the environment in their own way, and you're better off sticking with meat and dairy. And obviously, the other argument that was missing was that it's not just vegans who eat avocados, and we also didn't see any comparisons in these almond milk or these almond kind of arguments of the impact on the environment of milk from non-human animals, which is still, regardless of how bad almond milk might be, is still worse environmentally. We also found veganism as hostile. I also found, the royal way there, with it being portrayed not only as oversensitive, right? Particularly with reference to the Jodie Casamajana case in 2019, where veganism in the UK was codified in laws as a philosophical belief. You've got a headline on the left there. If I offer hungry vegan work colleague half my ham sandwich, will that be a hate crime? So the vegan's not only oversensitive for not back, but also she may end up in prison. Ray Hartley-Brewer, the person who wrote this. So this sort of threat to social order, you've got all the headlines up there: vegans, vegan extremism, vegan terrorism. Vegans are just terrorists was another article. The farmer was saying that about activists who've gone on the farm and liberated pigs, I believe. So you've got this portrayal as vegans not only being a threat to the social order through changing our kind of our meat eating culture, but also there's violence that they're associated with, right? And actually, it's not that vegans are saving animals. No, what they're doing is they're actually harming humans, right? I mean, even the word in itself, the rise of veganism is hitting dairy bosses hard. This isn't a violence towards non-human animals. This isn't a lack of violence towards non-human animals. What it is, it's an economic violence on humans. It's making them lose jobs. It's causing them stress. It's frightening them. It's a form of terrorism, right? And obviously, using words such as extremism and terrorism is deeply, deeply problematic. We've obviously seen issues with Stop Hunting and the Stop Hunting campaign in the US, where people have actually been sent to prison for liberating non-human animals from farms. So this kind of language being used in UK newspapers is very disconcerting. And finally, I guess the most interesting finding for me was the absolute lack of reference to non-human animals in articles discussing veganism. I only found that in 3.5%, of half of which were in one paper, The Independent. And this obviously got me thinking of Carl Adams' concept of the absent reference, the rendering of the non-human beingness. So these discussions around veganism, without actually mentioning really what I'd like to think that most of us are vegan for, right? It's to stop the absolute unnecessary destruction, the brutality towards the torture, the oppression of non-human animals. And what you would see, even in those articles that did mention the non-human, the language would be, what Adams would call innocuous phrases, which would allow for readers and for the writers, I guess, to morally disengage from the reality, right? The moral disengagement of which Davis speaks. So, I've got a couple of examples up there. You know, you've got this artificially inseminated with semen drawn mechanically from a bull. Now, look, this is very scientific language. It makes it sound like it's something perfectly normal. It's something that is done. Whereas actually what it is, the reality of it is this is a form of sexual violence on the bull and on the cow. But this is hidden in this sort of language of, well, we just mechanically take semen from them and we insert it into the cow as if this is a perfectly normal, okay, acceptable thing to do, whereas actually it's a brutal sexual assault on a sentient being. And finally, I guess, moving towards conclusions, I'm aware that I've been speaking for quite a while. I could probably go on a lot more, but what I concluded was that, you know, print media, despite its waning sales, it's still incredibly influential. We've seen that with the UK political landscape, how it can still play an important role in shaping the political debate. And I think that still it has the power to basically, you know, create the other, right? We see this on a regular basis, and also newspapers do have social media platforms. They do publish articles online, so people are still, the reach is still incredibly powerful. And I think overall, you know, from 2020, at least the period that I analysed, vegans are still portrayed negatively, unnecessarily. And what this does is, of course, you know, that these negative portrayals, that they reinforce the stigma, maintains vegans as others. And, you know, it stops people going from vegan, which is obviously backed up by research, right? Markowski and Roxburgh's study, which found that, you know, people are fearful of going vegan because of how they are perceived by family and friends. Well, you know, if newspapers are telling us that vegans are weird, or hostile, or dishonest, then of course anyone contemplating going vegan is going to be hesitant to do so because of the fear of being rejected by, you know, their local community or their family. What this means, of course, is that the caste system is further entrenched, right, and the ongoing brutality, oppression and torture of non-human animals continues. So from, I guess, an activist perspective, what I've really taken from it is that, you know, we as activists need to just strive to counter misinformation. So anytime we see, you know, newspaper articles, listen to podcasts where people are framing vegans in a certain way, portraying vegans negatively, we just need to challenge them, call it out. It's as simple as that. Pile on editors and journalists, write to MPs, whatever it is you feel may help you to get the alternative point of view across. And for me, on a personal level, it's about, you know, leaving the echo chamber on occasion. I think because it can take quite a lot out of you. Working in fields where, you know, you feel like sometimes you sometimes feel so frustrated that you can't just turn and say, why the hell are you not vegan to everyone? I think I sometimes find myself in an echo chamber, and I'm kind of engaging with people who have similar views to me just to stop that pain. Sometimes I need to stop doing that. I need to get out of the echo chamber and remind myself why I need to continually challenge these negative portrayals, because ultimately it's not about how I feel, it's about the non-human animals that are oppressed in the billions every single year. And finally, further research, further down the line, I would love to explore, I guess, newspapers now, or, you know, any other form of media, really. We've got TV, film, social media, and to see whether or not, you know, maybe the kind of impacts of COVID have had any influence on how people see their relationship with food, and whether or not that's kind of encouraged more people to go vegan. Obviously, the Castle McJarna rule, it'd be interesting to see whether or not there have been actually any, I guess, cases within workplaces of people using this particular ruling to prosecute their employer if need be. And of course, we've had the two IPCC reports from 2019 and 2021 basically telling us that we need to transition to plant-based in order to mitigate, to stop the worst effects of climate change. And I think finally, I'd love to explore some media from outside the global north. Argentina, for example, a country that has, you know, it relies heavily on the exploitation of beef, and, you know, it's, I think, per capita has the biggest beef consumption in the world. I'd be interested to see whether or not veganism is portrayed overwhelmingly negatively in newspapers, whether it's, you know, alluded to at all. And of course, India as well, where there is a high percentage of vegetarians. There's a long historical relationship between, you know, the Hindu belief and the non-consumption of non-human animals. It'd be interesting to see how veganism is maybe portrayed in a country such as that. And there, I will leave it. There's a big list of references there. I'm perfectly happy to send those on to people along with the slides should they wish. And if you want to reach out to me just to question me on what I've presented, or to just tell me how bad it is, feel free to do so. You can get me on Twitter, Instagram, which I'm never on, to be honest with you. No one wants to see my face on a photo, but I'm on Twitter quite a bit, and obviously emails are answered. And I've just set up my own website as well, which has got one blog on it. Right now, I should really start writing more, but hey, it's all about time, isn't it? Anyway, just want to say thanks ever so much for listening. Really, really delighted to have done this, and all I can say is solidarity and love. Thanks ever so much.
Okay, all complaints, please send to him immediately. Terrible presentation, just joking. It's a real shame he couldn't be with us today because it was really fascinating to see all the hard work you put into that and how it builds on top of that earlier existing research and exciting opportunities for further research. So I'm going to just jump right on top of that, if that's okay, and then we'll do the Q&A afterwards. Let's see here. And by the way, if anyone wants to do Q&A for Norm, I'm happy to put those emails to him or to tweet. Let's see here. Sorry, just a moment. All right, how's that? Yeah, Zoe? Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, Norm's research was kind of born out of his PhD path, but this actually, like I mentioned earlier, I thought I could put this together rather quickly for the book that Josephine and Zoe have been working on basically the impact of COVID-19 and pandemics on relationships with other animals. So this is a replication study where I do pretty much, look at British media in a snapshot, but I specifically looked at 2020, which was really at the height of the pandemic kind of crisis, lockdown, and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to present those findings. And my argument here is that I definitely see that vegaphobia is, well, I say vegan phobia, but whatever. Vegan phobia is still a persistent issue, but I would argue actually that veganism, there's evidence here that it has increased in popularity, and that's worth celebrating, I think. Representations have obviously changed. There's a lot of political context that has happened. Norm very helpfully went over a bunch of those at the end of his presentation. I was thinking about COVID-19 those in specifics because in social movement theory, we might see this as a political opportunity. So political opportunities and social movements, we basically we can strategize all day long. We can mobilize all the resources. We can have the right people in charge. We can, really hunker down and do the best strategy we can. But at the end of the day, if the political opportunity is not there, it can be difficult for activists to make any headway. So I was looking at how maybe COVID-19, this immense crisis that really shut the whole world down and made us reevaluate so many aspects of our modern life, was looking at that as potentially an area that could open the window for veganism. Also in social movement theory, we're very much so interested in the media, although I think it's very important to see in the chat, people are talking about the changing influence of the media. Mainstream newspapers, of course, do not have the same influence that they once have had. There's more social media now that's kind of countering that. But nonetheless, wherever the media is coming from, this is important for social movements because it draws attention. It amplifies our voices, amplifies our claims and our grievances. So traditionally, veganism has negotiated with that, with these mainstream channels, hoping to raise awareness, trying to mobilize people, get them off the seats, trying to draw in other resources, and also to put pressure on policymakers and corporations and industries. But there's tons and tons and tons of research to show that actually working with the media, which in a lot of ways is necessary, is a double-edged sword. It comes with quite a lot of risk because once you start to negotiate with the media, you can't actually fully control the spin they're going to take or what they're going to cut out of it or what they're going to highlight. So unfortunately, while this is important for a lot of social movements, mainstream media tends to be very problematic for social movements in general, not just veganism. So as the Cole and Morgan study very famously found, that most coverage has traditionally treated veganism at best as being barren or boring or just something that's a passing fad, it's cool now, gone tomorrow. But at worst, something dangerous or hostile, and as Norm was highlighting in his research, even terroristic. So when we're looking specifically at how veganism is represented in the media and how animal agriculture is represented, Carrie Packman-Friedman has done a lot of work on this and found that newspapers definitely set the agenda. And that should come as no surprise, because increasingly these mainstream media sources have been consolidated so that they are controlled by fewer and fewer mega corporations. And obviously a lot of those very rich and powerful mega corporations want to maintain the system as it is because it profits them. So there's a major disincentive to disrupt speciesism, and therefore that trickles down into mainstream media spaces where there is a lot of pressure not to put stuff that's too radical that would disrupt the people who are basically owners of this media channel. And so one of the things that we see that with this mainstream media is how they get around this, because like it or not, veganism is still persisting and is still popularizing. One of the ways that they're getting around that is to kind of take out the politics. So this is a major part of my research vein right now, and various projects I'm working on. I'm seeing this kind of response. So as veganism persists well into the 21st century, it has to be accounted for in some way. So what we start to see is that it becomes very individualized. So the emphasis is taken away from the responsibility of animal agriculture. It's taken away from climate change, is taken away from collective responsibilities. It's taken away from political or corporate responsibilities. And instead, it's kind of pushed onto the individual. So sociologists in the room should definitely be like, ding, 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 because when we start individualizing social problems, can be a major way of depoliticizing them and obscuring the magnitude of them and how we actually can solve them. So the other way that this happens is when we see the marketplace sort of dominate the media. And this is one of the major consequences when we saw in the mid-1990s, this increasing conglomeration of our media, is that now it's more and more about selling stuff. So now the marketplace really becomes part and parcel with media discourse. So industries tend to be protected. Individuals will be scapegoated. Sorry for the speciesist word, but it's the actual thing that happened to goats as well. So scapegoated. And we get pressured to consume. So media just becomes not just a place where we get information, but where we get a sales pitch. So we need to think about what it means then when we have veganism, which is ultimately a political position, but also literally about how we consume. What happens to veganism when it goes to the marketplace? So I looked at this in a very exploratory way. I expected to use some of the same coding that Matthew and Karen used, but I also was thinking about how things may have changed in the 15 years or so since they conducted that research. So I basically just looking at a content analysis in the year 2020, again, looking at that COVID, that high COVID year. I kept it a little bit more simple because I feel like I had the luxury of a lot more material. So I basically just searched for the keyword vegan, and I came up with way more than I could possibly use. And Norm even condensed his down in his study. He only looked at a few months. So I thought I was going to look at the whole year because a whole lot happened in 2020. But there's no way I could code 41,000 articles. So I just did a 1% sample of about 420, which was pretty comparable to actually what Matthew and Karen did in their study. But actually, that was all. I'll come back to that. That's one of the big things is the number of articles that had increased was really astounding. I reused a lot of their negative, really all of their negative coding, but I found that because things had changed a little bit in the conversation that just coding them as positive wasn't enough. There was some new room for some subcoding. So if it was a product spotlight and the newspaper seemed like excited about it and was framing it in a positive way, I included that. Weight loss, I mean, fat shaming is a major problem, and the medicalization of obesity is a problem. And like, obviously marketplace loves fat politics because it can exploit people, but the way it was being framed was positive. So I did include that as a positive frame. A lot of climate friendliness showed up. It's supposedly more healthy. If it's more delicious, framed as more delicious. If ethics were highlighted at all. If there was actually a few articles that were advising people on how to transition. So I included a frame for that as well. A coding scheme for that. And then of course, good old neutral. There's quite a lot of those. And my PowerPoint is freezing because I just had to let somebody in the room. I can get around it. Here we go. Okay, what did I say here? Yeah, and I had difficulty identifying what would be neutral or not. I basically said if it's like even amounts of positive and negative and I'm having trouble discerning, I just said it's neutral then. But if it's just matter of fact, then it was also neutral. Quite a lot were basically that. We're like, this is the thing, this is the product that is available, you can buy it here. It's just, you know, information. It's not really spinning it in any way. So my results were, first and foremost, what I mentioned a moment ago, is that, whoa, I was really blown away. And Matthew and Karen, I think, if you can correct me if you're wrong, but I think in your study and their study originally, they coded every article that they could find, which was only about 400. Whereas here we are 15 years later or so, and it was 41,000 that came up. And they used multiple keyword terms, by the way. I just used the word vegan, and it just exploded. There was so much more. So I also wanted to break it down by newspapers, make sure I'm getting a little bit of both. I basically looked at all the newspapers that came up, and we had the right-leaning newspapers. I was actually kind of surprised. They're about equally likely to discuss veganism positively or negatively. A lot of the positive coverage had to do with products, like new stuff to buy. And so that actually would fall in line with those more conservative aims with the right-leaning journals, because that's more about, you know, pro-capitalism and all that good stuff. So you can see how veganism might be co-opted into that. The left-leaning journals are obviously more likely to discuss veganism positively, but there's some caveats. Like I would have expected The Guardian, for instance, to be the big, you know, the big old leftist green one, because they're always harping on about climate change. But actually The Guardian was was much less likely to feature veganism, and their coverage was overwhelmingly neutral. And I was really not very pleased with, they had quite a lot of negative stuff as well. So my whole perspective on The Guardian, they're never going to get me to donate now. The Independent was actually the best, the one that positively framed it the most. So the majority of the articles that they offered. So much for that, Independent. Again, a lot of that has to do with products and services. I'm going to come back to that. I'm not going to dwell here, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you want to pause and check this out. I'm also going to upload this presentation to my website, so you can come back and look at the data if you'd like to. Yeah, so I just want to quickly break down what I found in my positive and negative. Across the positive results, which was 136 articles, this is about products and services, and 28 articles alone had to do with the Greggs product line. And again, if you're not living in England, like I'm an American, I never even heard of Gregg, but Gregg is this like quintessential British like sausage roll shop. It's kind of like McDonald's is to Americans. And you can go in there and any Greggs anywhere and go get for £1 this delightfully unhealthy but so delicious sausage roll. And it was a major kind of infiltration into British culture when that happened. I could write a whole paper on Gregg sausage rolls. So when Gregg launched a bunch of this stuff, especially during Veganuary, you see a big spike in articles that talked about products. The rest had to do, a lot of them had to do with ethics. A lot of them have to do with the trial that we were talking about earlier. Some of them talked about the health benefits. 16 articles out of the 400 so that I looked at talked about how veganism was just delicious. And then the rest were kind of a mix of the other positive codes that I introduced earlier. I was really glad that Norm also pointed this out. I was really, one of the most astonishing things, besides how much more veganism had grown as far as numbers in the media, but the most astonishing thing otherwise would be that only one of the articles that I sampled actually spotlighted non-human animals. The rest of them were about the vegans or about vegan food or making fun of vegan stuff, but only one of them actually really truly talked about and spotlighted it rather. Some of them may have had a passing mention, but this is the only article that actually spotlighted non-human animals as persons with interests of their own and not getting derailed by veganism being a hoax or veganism being terroristic or whatever else. But even in this article, it seems a little bit kind of like claptrap. I don't know. It doesn't seem to take it as seriously as they would have done maybe if that was like a human or something like that. So again, very, very, very astonished to find only one article there. Other negative results, you can imagine a lot of these were going to be the right-leaning ones, but also a lot of the smaller community-based newspapers also tended to be negative. Again, here's the same sort of codes that we see popping up with the previous two studies that we looked at today. It's most of them were about it being dangerous or impossible. 15 of them were ridiculing it. Quite a few were showing that vegans as hostile. Some were showing them as overly sensitive. and just a handful now about it being aesthetic or just being a passing fad. We can't call it a fad anymore, I don't think, because it's here to stay. I think that's one thing people are waking up to. All right, so getting back to the COVID bit, this is the other thing I was looking at. I wanted to replicate the earlier study, but I also wanted to see what was going on with COVID. Really, there's not much to say. I was kind of shocked by this. So 22 articles out of the 420 that I coded mentioned COVID about being a motivation for going vegan. And actually, most of those were positive. So that was kind of cool. It's just, there wasn't so much of a mention as I was expecting. 43 of them mentioned it as an impetus for changing our shopping patterns. So obviously during the lockdown, a lot of people started ordering online. A lot of people had to go to different shops. I mean, I started going to shops I never would have before just because I was trying to beat the crowds. So actually a lot of articles were trying to cater to people's strategies for coping with that. And a lot of people are also reevaluating their relationship with food as far as, is it healthful? So I think the mainstream media was trying to pick up on that as well. Again, not anything to do with animal ethics, but really people trying to homestead and be healthier and be better prepared for pandemics in the future. A lot of those were just product related, trying to push stuff, trying to get people to buy stuff. But again, a good chunk of those were positive. So that's kind of cool. Again, complete invisibilization of animals. I did come across a recent study that was suggesting that with COVID, it was going to dramatically change our relationship with meat. But actually, I didn't see much conversation about that at all in this sample. The only thing that kind of popped through, and again, I just did a small sample of 420 out of 41,000 articles. So maybe if we did a stronger search, a more concentrated search, we could come up with more. But the only thing that kind of crept through into my sample was Viva. Viva is kind of like it's an animal rights vegan organization here in the UK. It's like a smaller version of PETA for the North Americans listening. But they did run a campaign, and this was actually unlike other animal rights groups. I think they were one of the only ones that actually launched a COVID campaign. And they did make a little bit of room in the newspapers, but one of them, The Independent, gave it some space. It's like, okay, this is interesting. Let's hear this out. But then you have other newspapers like the Mirrors. It's like, this is ridiculous. And how dare they blame the pandemic on how we eat animals? So as far as ethically and politically, COVID really didn't make any difference as far as veganism. Instead, most of this was about stuff to buy. So of those, half of the sample that was coded as positive, half of the whole thing was coded as positive, by the way, in this study, which I think is good. But a lot of that was because it was about product placement. So is that really positive if we're not talking about animals at all? If we're just framing veganism as something cool and fun to buy and it's exciting and it's positive, but what does it have to do with animals? So a third of the 136 articles related to positively framed product launches. That's a big old boatload. It's just, that's what it's about now. It's not about animal rights. It's not about the crisis of COVID. It's about what can we sell. So same thing with my neutral articles. A fourth of the articles in the study were neutral, and most of those had to do with stuff to buy. And again, lockdown was shown as an opportunity to buy. It was about testing out new products, trying new takeaway menus, signing up for delivery services that were vegan. So now we have a smorgasbord basically of vegan things to buy. And that's really what the media, the spin the media is now trying to take. Yes, we have a lot of the negativity, but veganism as a consumption lifestyle is now gaining legitimacy through the marketplace and becoming a lot less threatening to mainstream media channels. In fact, I also found quite a few articles that were speaking to not just the regular everyday consumer, but actually people who are looking for investment opportunities, people who were looking into economics, maybe in the restaurant business or something. And it was very clearly framed as, here's a way that you can invest and make money. If there's any kind of ethical mentions at all in these sort of marketplace articles, they would be very brief, to the point where I don't think most people even pay attention. Just to give you a quick example, this guy, he's doing he's a commercial vegan chef, and it was a 1,200 word essay that was in the food and drink section. And so basically they're spotlighting his amazing story. This kid is like rising up to be an amazing chef, selling a bunch of, like, here's what he's selling, here's where you can buy his stuff. And only briefly mentioned this little bit. This is the only little bit that had to do about animals in the 1,200 word essay, where they briefly mentioned that the reason he went vegan is because he didn't like the way animals are treated. We don't know anything about how they were treated. We just mentioned the kid doesn't like it. But don't worry about that. Here's more stuff to buy. Buy. So it really becomes just a quick soundbite, and it's not really taken seriously. It's not given any precedence. It's really about how can we get you to buy stuff, because that political stuff is going to be off-putting, I think, is the argument here to make. So marketplace is supposed to be a little bit more neutral of that. You want to feel comfortable, happy, excited to purchase. If you're thinking about the death and the gloom of slaughterhouses, maybe not such a nice place to buy things, right? You're not in that purchasing spirit. So just to conclude, I would actually argue that veganism was predominantly presented more positively. So about half of my coded sample was actually presented positively. But again, a lot of that had to do with consumerism. There was an existing momentum of veganism. I don't really think COVID had much of an impact on this increased popularity or increased a positive sort of spin. I think actually this is just an old marketplace tactic that's been in place way before COVID came along. So when COVID was mentioned, again, it was about selling and promoting new products or services. So veganism, it could have been emphasized as important. I mean, honestly, this is one of the reasons, by the way, that we founded the Vegan Sociology group. This is one of the reasons we started this annual conference. Is when the pandemic happened, we knew from our research that what we're doing, this is directly relevant to pandemic prevention, because our relationship to other animals is the reason why we have zoonotic disease after zoonotic disease. Our relationship, our exploitative relationship to other animals, our oppression of other animals is the reason COVID-19 happened. And yet that was completely invisible in this sample that I took, except for that one little Viva campaign that popped out, and then the mirror, of course, bashed it. So I think this was an amazing opportunity that could have been taken advantage of, but most animal rights organizations stepped back from it. Professional sociology surely backed away from it. And we basically just left it to the marketplace. And so it was all about what can we sell? And I think it was a major missed opportunity. And by the way, I didn't put this in the slideshow, but Veganuary, which is a campaign that was started by a nonprofit, World Vegan Day, and there's a couple other activist created media spaces that, I mean, like World Vegan Day was started in the 90s by the Vegan Society to draw more attention to veganism, hoping to get the media's attention. And I could see in the sampling that worked, especially Veganuary. So if animal rights organizations, if activists actually worked with the media in that way to create a story, help to co-create the story rather than just being afraid, stepping back, and then letting the media have free reign, I think we could have a much better outcome in this complete missed opportunity that was COVID-19. So yeah, vegaphobia may be cured to an extent, but the antidote, unfortunately, seems to have been commodification of veganism and animal rights. Really not even animal rights, it's all about veganism. Animals are non-existent in this story. So I will leave it at that. So if you have any questions, I think now I can leave it open